Well, hi again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of 100 Yards of Football. Let's welcome back Vincent Turner, who's been away for a little while, had to visit family, had to take care of some business. We missed him last week. Vincent, welcome back. First and foremost, tell us a little bit about your trip and what you were able to do by not talking about football for just a little bit, right? You got a couple of conversations in with mom and dad without having to talk about football. You got to talk about food, you got to talk about how mom's feeling, and no football, right?
Now, let me correct you on that. You wrong, young man, because it was football talk all through the Turner house when I
No
got
way.
home. But I want to say this, is always glad to be back. This is something I love to do. I got a tremendous team behind me. Y'all did an outstanding job with our producer today, Jeremiah Long. I want to say thank you to you, Mr. LeBel, and your son, Brian. Outstanding job. Logan Landers, you was outstanding. Mr. Stephen Travers, outstanding. I couldn't be more blessed. And I enjoyed, even though I was in Memphis, I was watching far away. As far as family, I would say this: it's nothing like family, man. My mom has been battling some serious problems, but she's gotten better as of yesterday, which is very, very happy. But I just love being around my family and talking football, man. My dad, 88 years old, taking care of my mother who's 86. I'm very, very blessed. I can't even say how blessed I am. Watching that, it sent chills through my body. And my dad did not want nobody to touch my mother. He had it all. Thank you, Mr. Chester Turner. Thank you. To my sisters, Rhonda and Stephanie, it's always a pleasure to be around you. I got a new grandnephew in the house. I sent you a picture, Hop. He's going to be the next superstar, the 901, Mr. Ronnie Foster Jr. the second.
He's already roaming.
And
He's
to my
ready to do it.
niece, Mrs. Erica Woodruff, and her nice daughter, Mrs. Miney. Man, it's nothing like family in a crisis. And I want to say thank you. And I love being back. And today we got a topic that I really been wanting to do for some years, but it's outstanding to be back. And I'm proud of everybody here, 100 Yards Football. And also, much love to my business partner, a guy that's like a brother to me, Mr. Ronnie Keebler, and to my man, Mr. Mark Denham. Thank y'all. So let's
All
get this
right.
party rolling.
Yes, let's do it. All right. Well, today's episode, we're going to talk about the title is The Missing Ring, but I would also throw in one of the most controversial seasons of football up to that time. Lots of things going on, but it was called the University Division. It was what the name for the NCAA Division One, which would later be, but 1966, full of all kinds of different stories and subtitles. It was an amazing year. And Vincent, as much as anything, it was a year for you to where you really started to fall in love with football, didn't you? There was a lot of things happening in our world, and non-football related things. Music was absolutely amazing in that year. I've got the Billboard Top 100. We'll talk about that in a minute, but introduce us to your specific reason for wanting to do this show.
66 for me was special because I was 6 years old going into the first grade, but I love sports. And I love sports so hard that my family said one day this young man might have a place in doing something on the next level. And when I say loving sports at another level, I mean getting the morning newspaper. Shouts out to the Commercial Appeal, the 901 Memphis, Tennessee, the oldest newspaper in the city. But most of all, just getting my parameters. And as you're a 6-year-old, you're doing so much. You're going outside. But I wasn't that type of kid. I was in front of the television. And 1966, it started with the NCAA tournament when that Texas El Paso team defeated Kentucky 72-65. Now I'm 6 years old, and all I understand from the premise, Texas El Paso had a 5 all-star black starting 5. And Kentucky was led by Adolph Ruff. They had this outstanding point guard by the name of Pat Riley. Hello, the Lakers to you, Mr. Harper LeBel. And watching that game, I believe it was on TSN or TVS. I can't think right now. But seeing that, I started thinking, okay, where is I'm at? The first black African-American 5 to win a national championship. So I'm dumbfounded. I never thought it would be even decided with race or anything. But then going into the football season, that summer, I read an article at 6 years old about the University of Alabama. And they said it was going for a three-peat. Some never done in college football. And it might have been Bear Bryant's best team. And they had this quarterback that I read about, Redneck Riviera, they called him, from Foley, Alabama, by the name of Kennedy Snake Stabler. But what was so great going into that year, my dad said he was going to try something new. He said, you know what? We're going to go up the road in Nashville, Tennessee. And I'm going to take y'all to Hale Stadium October 1st to see this team who my dad was saying, this is the best college football team in the country. Even though they might play Division II, even though they might not play the competition as Alabama. But it was the Tennessee State Tigers that I saw up close and personal. Eldridge Dickey, Claude Humphrey, Nolan Smith, Johnny Coleman. They rolled through that season, man, outscoring their opponents 365 to, I can't even remember, like 51 points. They had 4 or 5 shutouts defensively. Then I thought about Alabama was rolling at that time. So in my mind, who's the best college football team? And all I know is this, it didn't matter to me which level. It was because I was watching Tennessee State play up close and personal. I was seeing Alabama on TV. But the season, it was so many great teams that year, so many great players. And I'm going to get to that later. But really stuck out in my mind was it cost, the minimum cost of a household was $7,125. To buy a nice 3-bedroom house, $10,000. A gallon of gas, 32 cents. A pack of cigarettes, 30 cents. And what I loved back then, a Coca-Cola for a nickel.
Nickel.
It was
a Hershey bar for a nickel too, couldn't you?
It was outstanding. But that's what we always say when you get to this age, and I'll be 65 in July. These are the memories you can never forget, and you never leave your mind and never leave your body. Back to you, Harp.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned the West Texas, or now Texas El Paso, the UTEP team playing against Kentucky, and it was the first for you, but it was the first for everyone. It had never happened before. You hadn't had an all-black team versus an all-white team for an NCAA championship, and things were changing. Obviously, the Miners pull out the victory there and end up being national champions, and it awakens everybody to the way that there's some things that are changing right before our very eyes. And it was, like I said, a first for you, and you're 6 years old, but it would, for the 50-year-old, for the 25-year-old, for the 90-year-old, it had never happened before. So it was an amazing time and a very interesting year. We mentioned the music. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but the price of a house and everything, but that was still changing. It was becoming more expensive. Our kick into Vietnam was beginning to step itself up in more different ways. So you had a whole group of high school seniors and college freshmen through seniors that were going, this could change my life pretty dramatically. So many other things that are a part of the culture at that time. The civil rights movement from Lyndon Baines Johnson was in full force, so to speak. It'd been 2 or 3 years into that. Lots of other things. But the controversy in the season, let's just stick right now with the NCAA football. The beginning of the year started with Alabama and Michigan State being the 2 top-ranked teams in the nation. That would prove to be a pretty wise decision in terms of that. Nebraska also received some votes. UCLA received some votes. Even Notre Dame down at the bottom. But it turned out to be they pretty much got it right at the beginning and go, hey, if you're going to watch a team to see who might win the national championship, Bama, because they had won 2 previously, and then you throw in, Michigan State and how good they were. They had won the Rose Bowl the year before. But talk a little bit about the controversy with them. Even if they had won the Big Ten that year, which they did, they wouldn't be able to go to a bowl game. What a ridiculous rule as I'm reading about this. Talk a little bit about where we are now with just the way the rules were. There were only 8 bowl games, and how on earth do they sort through all this?
I think back then, as you just stated, obviously it was unfair because a lot of teams in Notre Dame during that year didn't even go to a ball game and had a tie. But getting back to the situation is that when I look at it, Alabama clearly, based on what they did the 2 previous years, should have deserved to stay number 1. But from what people were saying, it was so much of a political climate. We all know about George Wallace. I don't want to get into that. The 16th Street bombing. They said that was affecting Alabama because the whole nation was looking at Alabama from a state in a different perspective. But that shouldn't have changed anything because they deserve to be number 1. There was back-to-back national champions in 64, 65. They had great players that led them to the national championships in Joe Namath, Steve Sloan, just so many great players. Then you had Bear Bryant, the figurehead, a guy that honestly reading about him during that time, I don't even know how anybody played for him because he had 3 philosophies that he went behind. You got to be stronger, you got to be committed, and you got to be disciplined. And he wasn't going to have it no way. And they said Brian Hall, he ran it like a boot camp. But to me, it was so much political because even though I might have not agreed with what was going on a lot of things in Alabama, but Alabama deserved to be number 1 and not to be preseason number 1. And then along with Michigan State. And Michigan State, with that rule, they couldn't go to the Rose Bowl because the Big Ten had a rule that, hey, the previous champion couldn't repeat. So that's why we're going to get into it later as you're going to bring up the game of the century, Notre Dame and Michigan State. But unfairly, Alabama was starting to get really, I think, bad pub from the start. Going into the season ranked number 1 preseason, all of a sudden, you don't even play a game. We got Michigan State number 1. And then Alabama, if you notice, open the season, they want to kind of penalize because they played against Louisiana Tech. And said, well, they're not playing nobody. But remember, they won that football game 34-0, and Louisiana Tech had a quarterback that's made millions of dollars. What's his name? Harp had a series called Duck Dynasty. Phil Robertson was the starting quarterback.
Yeah.
So it was unfair. Back in that time, like you said, we only had 8 bowl games, but it's a whole different ball game now when you look at how college football is shaped. And me personally, I love the format we have now. But during that time, you just had so many people from some parts of the country. Oh, I'm going to take care of my Big Ten breezing. And remember, Notre Dame hadn't won a national championship, I believe, in 9 or 10 years. And they had a coach by the name of Eric Parseghian who was very lobbying for Notre Dame to be in the mix. And it was a really pressure time because when we all look at this, Alabama's trying to be the first school in history to be a 3-peat champion on the national championship level. They had a program that what Brad Brown was taking that hadn't seen since Oklahoma did it in 54 and 54 through 1956 under Bud Wilkerson. Back to you, Hart.
Well, let's take a look at some of the games that led up to the game of the century. Michigan State started against North Carolina State. They played Penn State. They were at Illinois. They went to Michigan, or they had Michigan at home, and then Ohio State. If this were today, you'd say, what a lineup. I mean, you go North Carolina State, Penn, Illinois, Michigan, then Ohio State, Purdue, who actually ended up being the representative from the Big Ten to go to the Rose Bowl there at the 1967 January 1st game. They were ranked number 9 when they play in the middle of the season. Northwestern Iowa and Indiana, they beat all of them. Look at what Notre Dame did. Real quick, I'm going to switch over. They start the season against Purdue, and Purdue was number 7 at that time. So their only loss going into that Michigan State team game against Michigan State and Purdue, their only loss Purdue had was against Notre Dame, and that was the season opener. Northwestern, Army, North Carolina, they played number 10 Oklahoma. They beat them, 38-0. That was at Oklahoma in Norman. They played Navy, Pitt, Duke, and the Michigan State game where they were 8-0 going into that game. Everybody else had played 9 games. Notre Dame played after Thanksgiving. They played at USC. That was a part of the tradition that they had already established with Southern Cal. At the end of the year, they always go out to California. In the middle of the year, SC goes out to Indiana and plays there. They walloped Southern Cal. We've talked about John McKay before, and John says we're never going to let that happen again. It was a 51-0 brutal beating. SC said we'll never let that happen. So that was pretty interesting that it turned out that way. So that's how Notre Dame gets their 10th game in. They were 9-0-1, but before the Michigan State game, and again, that's the game of the century. Both teams come in, they're undefeated, and here's a picture right here. I love this picture. This number 55, the linebacker for Michigan State, who's got his back to the camera, but he's standing right under the middle of the goalpost and making Notre Dame go around him. All right, this is Mars Stadium. Look at how many people are there. They are packed to the gills, Vincent. And Notre Dame comes out onto the field to begin the ball game. They have the national anthem. It's pretty amazing right there. But the mood going into that game, and we'll talk about Alabama in a second, but that game, for obvious reasons, and it was the first season, Vincent, that they had color television for their college games. They used to be all in black and white. So even though this picture is in black and white, obviously the viewing audience got to see the game in color.
Really, a first game that I really sat down and watched in front of the TV, and what I remember was a partly cloudy day, smoke coming up from behind East Lansing Stadium, and just Chris Schenkel and Bud Wilkerson doing their thing at another level. If some of them people out there today, you need to take kind of a chapter out of their book and see how they do college football. I'm not calling no names, but I'm just putting it out there. But that game, I remember first quarter, Terry Hanratty, the hotshot sophomore quarterback for Notre Dame, gets knocked out of the game by the young man from Beaumont, Texas, AKA Police Story, Mr. Bubba Smith. And I remember Michigan State jumped up 10-0, and Coley O'Brien came in the game. And I remember people throughout the game, Chris Schenkel was saying, well, Michigan State has got this game covered. And I believe Notre Dame went in the halftime down 10-0. But Notre Dame was able to come back 10-10. And it was one of the most hardest hitting games in college football history because some people got hurt in that football game. But what more can you say? It was about 2 minutes to go. Notre Dame had a chance to move the ball downfield. Eric Parsegian said, oh, no, we're going to run 3 plays and we're going to take a tie going out of here. And I remember everybody saying, well, why Notre Dame is taking the tie? Why Notre Dame take? But we knew Michigan State could not go back to the Rose Bowl and have, I want to say, something in their repertoire to say, hey, we deserve to be number one. So I understood what Eric Parsegian was doing. But that game was between two great teams, great players in the game that went on and had great NFL careers. Notre Dame, Jim Lynch went on, got a Super Bowl ring with the Chiefs. Rocky Bly went on, got a Super Bowl ring with the Steelers. Bob Kuechenberg, that a lot of people don't mention, God for the Miami Dolphins. Then, of course, Terry Hanratty and Aaron Parsegian, who at the time was a young, good-looking man, too. Didn't even look like a football coach. Then you had Michigan State.
Hold on. Don't forget Alan Page. Did you mention Alan?
I'm sorry. You're right.
You're going Notre Dame greats, and man, Alan Page was on that team too. So what a terrific group of guys that were assembled for that game that obviously moved on to the next level and were able to play. You go.
And then Michigan State, they had NFL stars all over the place. Clint Jones, as I mentioned, Bubba Smith, Jimmy Ray being the African-American quarterback, Gene Washington at the wide receiver spot, and then Duffy Doherty. And really going into that football game, everybody thought Michigan State was going to kill Notre Dame. But Notre Dame came out of that game, 10-10 tie, and then everything shifted down south. Because that team that you wearing that nice shirt today, they was humming, man. They was playing football down there in Tuscaloosa. Back to you, Hawk.
Yeah, so the game of the century, what you're looking at, folks, is really an epic battle. And I can understand Parsegian's decision too. I may not agree with it necessarily, especially, you're there to win. How are you going to say to your recruits, to the guys coming out of high school, that you want to have attended your university and play on your football team, that we're here to win when you were there to tie? So I get that. But remember, folks, this is in a different era. And this is when people were still saying at this time, even though the forward pass was fully in play, there weren't a whole lot of people that were doing forward passes. And the rule back then was there's three things that can happen when you throw the ball, and two of them are bad. It could be an incompletion or it could be an interception. My rule is, looking at it from a different perspective. Well, there are three things that can happen in a running play, and two of them are bad. You can get a tackle behind the line of scrimmage for a loss, or you could fumble. So I don't necessarily agree with that logic, but it doesn't matter. That was the logic of the day. That was the way people looked at it. And unless you had, hand ready could throw, but you look at the stats, he's only thrown for 150 yards a game, if that. And there's some games where there were quarterbacks all over the place in college football that were throwing for under 100 yards. They didn't need to. Ken Stabler doesn't have great stats, but you mentioned Alabama and what they were doing. Their season ends up opening against Louisiana Tech. They win 34-0. They go to Ole Miss. They play in Oxford, 17-7. And then 2 weeks later at Tennessee, they were trailing the Volunteers 10-0 in the fourth quarter. They get a touchdown, a 2-point conversion, and a field goal with just a few seconds left in the ballgame. They win that one 11-10, and then they go on a rampage. They're scoring 40, 25, 20. They had 5 shutouts that season. They only gave up a total of 44 points in the whole season. It's just amazing how good Alabama was at that time. However, Notre Dame was pretty dang good. They only gave up 36 points that year. They scored over 350, and they only gave up 35. So let's go back to Alabama, because the show is here today. We're focusing on Alabama. Louisiana Tech, they're at Legion Field in Alabama. They open up against 63,000 fans, and they start with their first win, and they start rolling.
One thing about that Alabama team that really stuck out to me, they had 16 seniors on their football team. And Ray Perkins was their best player along with Ken the Snake Stabler. And to be honest, Hop, I didn't really realize how good Ray Perkins was as a football player in college. Went on, got drafted by the Baltimore Colts, became a great coach, ended up coaching, well, a lot of people saying the best defensive player that ever played the game. But I didn't really know how good he was. Mr. Perkins was the fastest player on the team, the most explosive player, and he kind of set the tone for the University of Alabama during that season. And as I just mentioned, they had 16 seniors, and the pressure was mounted. Because Bear Bryant, don't let everybody fool you, he wanted that three-peat. And they had came off, as I mentioned earlier, winning the national championship in 64. After the ball, they voted the champion for the bowl game. That year they had the outstanding loss in the Orange Bowl against Texas. Tommy Nobles made the goal line stand against Joe Namath. Then in 65, they lose the opening game to Georgia. They come back, run the table. They beat a real good Nebraska team in the 65 Orange Bowl. But this team here, with the experience they had, the players they had, and then they had their quarterback out of Mobile with Foley, Alabama, who a lot of people were saying might be the best player on the center. The expectations was high for Bear Bryant. And I never forget this. You brought the Tennessee game up, which was the toughest game on their schedule for them that year. Mm-hmm. That game right there was played in a rainstorm. And I remember leading up to the game, Bear Bryant flew the team in on a Friday. And I guess the people that invite you in and makes you play stable for your football team, the University of Tennessee had some people that greeted the Bear, gave him a key to the city, told him, hey, we could take the team around if you want us to show you the city while you're here. Bear took this key that one of the University of Tennessee alumni gave him, threw it in the garbage can in front of the people, and said, hey, we're not here to, we ain't got no time. We're here to play football. We on a mission. And during that week, it rained all week in Tuscaloosa, so they had to practice going back a little bit in Forest Auditorium where the University of Alabama basketball team played. And they said Bear snapped on the player. Said, hey, you playing football like doodle-doo, like a turd. I ain't going to use the other words. Get that H out of here. Matter of fact, get my ish, and you get off campus. I'm taking your scholarship. So that morning, Friday morning, Before Alabama gets on the plane, he apologized to the team and he apologized to the player. Man, Bear Bryant, it was no other way with him. Go read the Junction Boys back in 1958. Read the book of Gene Stallings and Jack Pardee on that Texas A&M team. The pressure had got so mounted that on any game on their schedule, it was the Tennessee game. And found out, Bear, that was one school, you listening, Jeremiah, that Bear Bryant detested. He hated. The third Saturday in October, it was all about beating Tennessee. And that was their toughest game on the schedule. And I remember Ken Stabler led them on a game-winning drive in the fourth quarter. And the rest is history. And after that, they kind of smoothed on out and took care of their business, ended up undefeated. Back to you, Hawk.
Well, as the season began, there was already some scrutiny that was taking place there. The commissioner of the SEC, his name is Bernie Moore. He penalized Alabama because they had too many freshmen that were on scholarship on that team. They had 42. So the investigation realizes that they are 2 over the 40 limit. So they were penalized by having a 38 scholarship limit placed on them for the following season during that 66 recruiting class. So it wasn't a bowl game suspension, and it wasn't a national penalty. It was just basically a due diligence conference related infraction. And so they were already, being looked at very heavily. But you mentioned the Tennessee game and the situation there with the rain and all that. Afterwards, they go to Vanderbilt. I'm sorry, they play Vanderbilt in Legion Field in Birmingham. They had 4 games in a row that were home games, but they had Legion Field, Denny Stadium on campus, Legion Field again, and then back on campus against Vanderbilt, Mississippi State, LSU, and then eventually South Carolina. And the last 4 games prior to the Nebraska Bowl game, 21-0, 24-0, 34-0, and 31-0. And that's against Auburn, Southern Miss, South Carolina, and LSU, just dominating. I mean, people couldn't get across the 50-yard line or into the red zone. It was a great team. And defensively, they were as equally good, if not better, than what their offense was. So the stage had been set for them to be national champions again. The vote, however, takes place before the bowl game. That's another thing about the NCAA that just, what were you thinking? How can you say who the national champion is going to be before they play their last game of the season?
It just didn't make sense to me back then. And unfortunately, that's a rule that I'm glad they changed, to be honest with you. Because why would you have the bowl games? The bowl game should be really the icing on the cake. And one thing about when you look at Alabama, they got also lucky that year too. They didn't play a Florida team that had the ball coach who ended up winning the Heisman, and then they play a Georgia team that went to the Cotton Bowl. So I would have gave them a little more credit also because of the conference being stronger. But the voting national championship before the end of the season, that's just crazy. But I think that year in 66, I think they waited after the season was over, if I'm not mistaken. But at the end of the day, clearly, and as we talked before off air, Harper, today is that I'm not taking anything away from Alabama. It was me. Alabama clearly did what they had to do on the field, and we're going to talk later about the Sugar Bowl performance, because that game right there, even though they went through their season undefeated, that was the game that I say greatness is upon us now. And that's the game that Bear Bryant, if any game was the 67 Sugar Bowl, this should to prove to people that he does walk on water there in the state of Alabama. Back to you, Hawk.
Yeah. Well, let's look at the SEC standings. At the end of the year, Alabama was 6-0, but so was Georgia. Georgia was 10-1, and they were ranked number 3. Alabama was, and Georgia number 4. Florida, which you mentioned, they were 5-1 in the conference, 9-2 overall. And again, you mentioned that Steve Spurrier was the Heisman Trophy winner. Another controversy is the Heisman Trophy was voted on in December And a lot of NFL teams had their draft in December. So again, the January game, you already knew and basically were ineligible to play because you were going to be a pro if you wanted to sign your contract. Ole Miss was 5-2. So Florida, Ole Miss, Georgia, and Alabama all had great teams that year. Vanderbilt, Mississippi State really struggled. They were at the bottom. Auburn only had one win in their final standings positioning. But SEC was strong. And for them to be in a position where they could be up for the national championship, I'm talking Alabama again, there was reason for them to argue that this is absolutely our championship. But as it turned out, the teams that they played against, there's a look at the scheduling right there. So you look at overall on the far right, 11-0 is how they figured it out. The end of the season, 10-1 for Georgia, 9-2 for Florida. Your top three teams only have 3 losses total. Alabama had only had 2 losses in the previous 3 years. So for obvious reasons, they should be and have the argument to be, we're number one. No one defeated us, so how on earth could you take that away from us? And we won against a top-ranked Nebraska team in the Orange Bowl, or whether they were in the Sugar Bowl or any of the other bowls that were around. The Rose Bowl was different, though. UCLA played Purdue that year, and Purdue represented the Big Ten, and Notre Dame did not go to a bowl game. So very interesting how this all turns out. And again, it's just ripe for controversy. So no matter who you pick, there's always going to be at least a third of your audience that's going to say, wait a second, it should have been me.
I think when you look at the end of the year after Alabama went through the conference undefeated, there was a lot of people saying, well, they're not going to get through Nebraska and Bob Devaney because Nebraska was a bigger football team. And even though the previous year Nebraska had the same type of offensive line and Alabama won that game in the Orange Bowl and won the national championship, everybody was saying on the national level, this Nebraska team is going to run all over Alabama because, number one, the quarterback. They didn't think Kenny Stabler could get it done. But really shocked me in that game on January the 2nd, 1967, is that how easily Alabama dominated Nebraska. Now, a lot of people don't understand this, but Alabama's offensive line was only 192 pounds. Nebraska defensive line was like 245. Ken Stabler didn't get touched throughout the whole game. He went like 12-18. I think a little bit over 218 yards. I think he had 3 touchdowns. He had 38 yards rushing. Ray Perkins had a game that we talk about all the time. Stars stand up when the lights get bright. 7 receptions for, I think, 148 yards. But as you see Bear Bryant on the shoulder of his players, the nation was so shocked that Alabama won that football game 34-7. To be honest, me being only a 6-year-old at that time, and a lot of the sports writers in the country, they probably saying, man, what is happening here? You're undefeated, you're untied, you came through arguably maybe the toughest conference in all of college football, and Notre Dame has a tie, and they don't even play in a bowl game. The mic has dropped today here on 100 Yards of Football. It's no way. You beat a Nebraska team that came in the football game, I think, ranked 8th, and you beat them by 27 in the Sugar Bowl on national television, ABC, and Notre Dame doesn't even go to a bowl, and they end up with a tie, and they still voted number 1, and then you come back, and I believe you vote Michigan State number 2. Hey, the jury's out there. But as I told you earlier, Harp, I think it was a lot how people really looked at Alabama's estate and all the political stuff that was going on in previous years. And unfortunately, that's where we stand in today. But when you look at it, the missing ring, that's a great topic for today. That Alabama team, is no question about it, should have been national champions based on what they did on the field. Back to you, Harp.
Yeah, when the vote was made, obviously prior to the Sugar Bowl in Alabama, and just a brief correction there is Nebraska was ranked number 6 going that bowl game. It was 17-0 at the end of the first quarter. Bama gets another touchdown. They're up 24-0 at half. Fourth quarter, scrub touchdown for Nebraska, but the damage had already been done. 34-7 was the final. Absolute dominance in front of 82,000 people there in Louisiana at Tulane Stadium. I think, between Bear Bryant, the coaching staff, and the players themselves, you said, hey, we're smaller. It doesn't matter. We've got something that they don't have, and it's in between our shoulders and a little bit below. They played with some heart and said that this is it. We're gonna do everything we can to make everybody look like they're wrong that had a vote in this. And in a way, they kind of did. But how do you resolve the problem? There's three teams that could each make a claim that we deserve to be here. And I know that the writers predominantly were from the Upper East, a lot of where all the papers are. You got the Washington Post, the New York Times, you've got the Philadelphia papers, the Pennsylvania area itself, the Midwest. The decision was made because they had seen both of those teams, Notre Dame and Michigan State, before, and there's nobody that's going to beat them. Alabama was a long ways away, and you mentioned the civil strife that was taking place. Some other things with George Wallace that would say quite easily, no, we're not going to reward Alabama for that. But Vincent, Alabama wasn't burning churches. Bear Bryant wasn't doing anything. He was just putting a football team out there on the field. So he could argue that has nothing to do with it. You vote for the best team, and that's us. We're the only one that's undefeated, untied.
Well, being in the South, and the South at that time was very difficult. There's no question about it. But sometimes when we look at athletics can be political too. I think that's what a lot of people miss the point there. And then during that time, coming into that season, there had been a lot of awful things that had happened in the state of Alabama those last 3 years, from 63 to 1966, leading up to this game and leading up to this season and leading up to this team. But I totally agree with you, Harper, that it should not have been judged what was happening outside sports, because you're correct. Bear Bryant didn't blow the church up. Bear Bryant didn't say the famous words of George Wallace on the steps of Alabama, segregation now, segregation forever. He wasn't Bull Connor back then. All he was trying to do was win a national championship, bring pride to the state, which he done in 64 and 65, and go for a three-peat. And he was just trying to be like them programs like the Oklahomas of the 50s, Nebraska of the 70s. And that was just it. But unfortunately, that was the time. And that's what we was dealing with then. But me being an African-American, me being righteous and me being right, looking at that season, like I said, it was a lot of great football. But in college football, if you want to judge and you want to be right and you want to judge performance on the field, there's no question about it. The University of Alabama did what they had to do. And they was the best team when it was all said and done.
All right, we've taken Alabama's side. Now let's look at Michigan State. 9-0-1. Their only blemish was a tie against Notre Dame. They did that at home. And we were penalized by not being able to go to the Rose Bowl because of a stupid rule that says you can't have repeat champions. However, Alabama was repeat national champions, so you should allow us to play, go out to California, beat UCLA, and then just settle this thing for good. But the Football Research Group, which was a number of writers, they end up voting Michigan State as the co-national champions. So take me through why and how Michigan State has a reason to say that we're co-champions, but we should be the only champion. But based on our schedule and who we played, and give me their side of the story and a case for them saying that no, Notre Dame didn't beat us, so we should be the national champion.
In essence, I keep it really short and plain in my life, and I don't try to make this difficult. Michigan State, you didn't have no bone because you weren't untied and you weren't undefeated. You had one tie. The team down in Tuscaloosa went through their season undefeated, and they won their bowl game. Now, you might have would have had an argument if you would have beat Notre Dame, and then we could have said, well, hey, we understand the bowl rule. But at the end of the day, it's like what I keep seeing. I kept researching. And I read that great book, some of it, The Missing Ring. Alabama was untied, undefeated. Case closed. Back to you, Harp.
Now it's Notre Dame.
Michigan, same with Notre Dame. You had that one tie. Alabama, goose eggs, 11-0. They did everything they supposed to do. They went through their schedule. And think about this. Now, you might want to say an argument if Alabama would have played Florida with the old ball coach Steve Spurrier, who won the Heisman with the great running back Larry Smith, or they would have had played Georgia, where they had that great quarterback in Kirby Moore, that great running back in Kent Lawrence, and that defensive end by the name of Bill Stanfield. But that didn't happen. Alabama stormed through their schedule. They did what they had to do. They beat a real good Ole Miss team. I don't want to go back. They had a good running back in Doug Cunningham. They beat a real good Auburn team, blasted them at the end of the year. Matter of fact, I was watching some of that game last night on YouTube. They had a pretty good player in Freddie Hyde. At the end of the day, it's no argument. I'm not a big-time Alabama fan. I respect them because I'm from the state of Tennessee. But at the end of the day, in this game, when you go untied, you go undefeated, you go through your bowl undefeated, it's no more to say. The mic has dropped. Notre Dame and Michigan State doesn't have an answer. They tied. And that's where I'm at in 1966. As much as I want to say, a lot of people, it's a lot of, I want to say, quote unquote, African-American brothers I know in the past. One thing we had to discuss, well, Alabama didn't have any brothers on the team. But I come back and I say this. It's 1966. We play who's in front of us. It don't matter they had any African-Americans on the team. The bottom line, they went 11-0. And for me, they beat a Nebraska team. They had like 10 African-American players and beat them easily. Easily. Ken Stabler, the most MVP in the game. Redneck Riviera, Foley, Alabama. And Ray Perkins had a game. 7 receptions, 148 yards, 2 touchdowns. There's nothing to be said. And I'm not going to disrespect the Alabama football team today because Johnny Mosley, Les Kelly, Jimmy Carroll, Johnny Sullivan, Cecil Dowdy, who was a first-team All-American, Wayne Cook, Richard Cole, and Dennis Holman, they was part of that football team and they deserved to have that national championship ring. Back to you, Hawk.
Yeah, very interesting debate that you could have whether there's a black player on your team or not. If you beat everybody that's on the schedule, isn't that what you're supposed to do? And when you do that, especially at the level that Alabama's at, you got to be considered for it. But the fact that they weren't even considered, they didn't get any votes. That's the thing that bothers me is that that just doesn't make any sense. So Notre Dame going 9-0-1 and not playing in a bowl game ends up being the quote unquote consensus national championship winners, but Michigan State, who finished number 2 in the polls, were considered co-champs, even though the tie there. And Notre Dame, you could easily say, look, we beat everybody on our schedule. We didn't lose to anybody. And the only game that we had a tie was at their place, and they were ranked, number 2 or number 3 in the nation at the time. So everybody has a claim in terms of an argument and a point that should be heard. They could only have one national champion, and Alabama was on the outside looking in for whatever reason. That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, especially after that win against Nebraska in the Sugar Bowl. Final thoughts, Vincent, before we're going to have a little fun and talk about some of the great songs that took place back in 1966 that were released during those days. But anything else regarding the controversy here, the missing ring, obviously the one that they should have had but never got. But you know what? Everybody that went to Alabama got a ring from the previous 2 years. Ken Stabler has 2, even though he didn't play in the previous ones. So it's not all that bad. You don't have a whole lot of room to complain, even though if it's your senior year and those 16 seniors, they should have had a 3rd ring. Unfortunately, they didn't get it.
My final thoughts, and I'm going to keep it real short and plain here. Much respect to the University of Alabama. Should have won the national championship that season. I would have loved to see them play the Tennessee State Tigers. I'm sorry. I would love that game. That Tennessee State team that had 22 players drafted in the next 3 years in the NFL. That's my only thought. That's my dream. Everything clean the table. Let's put the best of the best. Because no disrespect to Notre Dame, no disrespect to Michigan State, to the HBCUs, I would have loved to see that Alabama team with Ken Stabler go head to head with Eldridge Dickey, the Lord's Prayer. And the only reason I'm saying that because I saw Tennessee State play up close and personal. And I saw Alabama. That's the only thing I regret. But respect to Roll Tide Nation, there's no question about it. They cheated y'all that year. So today, if you're watching 100 yards of football, you can say this: these two gentlemen right here understand your pain, and you should have won. You should have been the first three-peat champion in college football history. Dun, 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 dun. Back to you, Hart.
Yeah. Well, whether he had a cigarette or a glass of whiskey, Bear Bryant was definitely a leader that got things done. And obviously, in his 7th, 8th, 9th year there at Alabama, he established himself as being one of the guys that said, you know what, you come play against us and you are in for a handful of hurt. We have a very good football team and we're going to prove it to you. All right, let's look at some of the top music. Now, the number one song for the year of 1966 was California Dreaming by the Mamas and the Papas, but the Monkees, the Four Tops, Nancy, and then Frank Sinatra were in the top 15, so to speak. You had Sergeant Barry Slater with the Ballad of the Green Berets. That was a song that really wasn't a song. It was just more of a chant, if you will. Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs were living large. Dusty Springfield. The Left Bank, which I've played a couple of their songs. They had one called Walk Away. Renee played that before at open mics. The Outsiders, Percy Sledge, the Rolling Stones, some group called the Beatles, the Temptations, Simon and Garfunkel, Ray Charles with Crying Time was in the top 50. Talk a little bit about some of the fun music that was coming out. You're only 6, so you're listening to AM Gold back in those days, right?
Remember that me being 6, I was in that Stax music era. One of the greatest, I want to say, accomplishments or dreams of my life. I was actually, at the time, I didn't think this gentleman was going to be really recognized as one of the greatest songwriters of the day. But I stayed 2 houses over from him. Mr. David Porter, who was one of the original songwriters for Stack Records. And I didn't know at the time. Grew up with his son. We're still close today, Greg. Send you a shout out today to 901 Memphis, Tennessee. But I didn't know what greatness was. So the music I was listening to, Soul Man, Sam and Dave, Soulfinger, the Barcades, the Soul Children, the great Isaac Hayes. And that was 66. Now, I didn't know that him and Mr. Porter was going to put one of the greatest soundtracks ever in music history, the Shaft soundtrack. I didn't know him and Mr. Porter was going to be writing for one of the greatest singers. He was a hell of an athlete, too, from the state of Georgia, Mr. Otis Redding. Yes, I used to see Mr. Redding at Mr. Porter's house. I used to see Rufus and Carla Thomas at Mr. Porter's house. But I was 6 years old, and I never, ever really took serious about that. But as I got older, and when I turn on, let's say I go to YouTube, I get excited. I get blood in my water. That's a southern sound. Then the great Johnny Taylor. Jody, I got your girl and gone. See, Harp, you can't relate. You relating to that now. See, I saw these people as a young man. And then, of course, just everything was great in 66, even though the greatest running back, who they say played in the National Football League, retired, Mr. Jim Brown. I remember that first movie I saw ever that I went to the theater, The Dirty Dozen.
Dirty Dozen, yeah.
I went back and looked at the lineup last night. Lee Marvin. Oh, my God. Charles Bronson.
Charles Bronson was in that movie, yep, right.
Ronald Sutherland. Teddy Savalas. Ernest Borgnine. Oh, my God. Richard Jackal. The big man from Texas, 6'7", Mr. Clint Walker. That's one of my favorite movies all the time. Matter of fact, today when I got some time this evening, I might draw that up. In the scene in the movie, Hop, remember the scene when Jim Brown, his name in the movie went by Private Jefferson, right? Remember when he had to drop auto grenades in them little holes, and it was at the German compound, and he had to get it in like 30 seconds. And he dropping the grenades in there. They said, "Come on, Jefferson, come on." He rolling, boy. And then that German machine gun comes out of nowhere. And Jim Brown is killed, and I start crying. What a year, 1966, baby. The Dirty Dozen. You had Bewitched on TV, one of my favorite shows. You had Gomer Pyle, former Alabama graduate Jim Neighbors. The Andy Griffin Show with Barney Fife. Bonanza, Little Joe, Hoss, Adam, Ben. It was no better than 1966, my brother. Back to you.
Easy times back then. Let's look at some of the top tunes. I Fought the Law by the Bobby Fuller Four. It was redone by The Clash, and that's the version I like the best. But the original, Yellow Submarine, Things, Along Comes Mary by The Association with all those different harmonies that they hit. The Turtles were a big band back then. They had You Baby was one of their top songs. Wilson Pickett had The Land of a Thousand Dances.
Yes, sir.
Bob Dylan, Rainy Day Women, number 12. Gosh, the Beach Boys with Barbara Ann. My World is Empty Without You by the Supremes. Lou Rawls with Love's is a Hurtin' Thing. Dionne Warwick was just coming into her own there. Message to Michael. Neil Diamond with Cherry Cherry. Bobby Darin, If I Were a Carpenter. Let me see. The Temptations, Beauty is Only Skin Deep. The T-Bones, No Matter What Shape You're In. Devil with the Blue Dress On by Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Reels. The top song, as we mentioned just a moment ago, California Dreamin', 96 Tears, What Became of the Broken Hearted, Last Train to Clarksville by the Monkees. And was their show on back then? Because, I'm only 4. I can't.
I think the Monkees came in 67.
Okay, so it was on the way, but not yet. These Boots Were Made for Walking by Nancy Sinatra. Cherish, again, another song by the Association comes out with an album. They get 2 songs that chart there. Good Lovin' by the Little Rascals. You're My Soul and Inspiration by the Righteous Brothers. I mentioned the Supremes, You Can't Hurry Love. Goodness gracious, what a great song that was.
Yes, sir.
See You in September. Little Red Riding Hood by Sam, the Sham, and the Pharaohs. Gosh, amazing. The Mindbenders, Dusty Springfield, Roger Williams, The Left Bank, The Capitals, Tommy James and the Shondells with Hanky Panky. Goodness gracious. My God. Yeah, Love and Spoonful was somewhere in this hot dang, somewhere in the city. Petulia Clark with My Love. Petulia was,
Can I say something?
Go ahead. Yeah, please.
One guy you mentioned up, and I'm sorry that he left us in 1973, but Bobby Darin was a very talented musician, man. That gentleman could play the piano. That guy could carry a concert, man, by himself. Want to give kudos to him today, Bobby Darin, and was an outstanding actor. Loved his work back in the late 60s and early 70s. He was very, very talented. Back to you, Harp.
Yeah, what a great artist, right? Singer, songwriter, and then a musician himself. Amazing. I Am a Rock by Simon and the Garfunkels was also in the top 50. Tommy Rowe, Crying Time by Ray Charles. Are you kidding me? Johnny Rivers had a song called Secret Agent Man. What a great tune that is. Love and Spoonful. Have you ever had to make up your mind? Cher had Big Bang was hers. Sloop John B by the Beach Boys.
Yes, sir.
Paperback Writer by some group called the Beatles. Beauty is Only Skin Deep by the Temptations. The T-Bones. Robert Parker, Paul Revere and the Raiders. Just some amazing stuff.
Paul Revere and the Raiders. Boy, remember them? Used to come out in them costumes, brother.
Yeah. Just Like Me was the tune that charted for them. Love's a Hurtin' Thing by Lou Rawls. Gloria by the Shadows of the Night. Just some amazing. Wilson Pickett, I mentioned him a little bit earlier. So just the beginning in my world of, I remember that song. I remember hearing it on the radio. I remember walking through a store and it was playing in the background. Just what is that? I've never heard that before. Just the cool stuff that you get exposed to, and an amazing time for music, obviously, and an amazing time for college football. We mentioned the controversy, and the tough decision to have to be made between three teams that had no losses, and only one of them had room at the top. So very interesting phenomenon how that took place. Vincent, what else did we need to go over between 1967 and where we are today?
When you look at 1966, man, look at all the great players that played in that college football season. We've had the opportunity today to talk about this great team, the University of Alabama, the great team, the Tennessee State Tigers, Notre Dame, and Michigan. But what I'm going to remember, all the great players, man. I didn't realize Steve Spurrier at Florida. Oh, my God. Bill Stanfield at Georgia. Jerry LaVallis at SMU along with Mike Livingston. Bob Greasy at Purdue. Floyd Little at Syracuse. Mel Farr at UCLA. Ron Yeri at USC. Man, it was some super football players. Nate Shaw at SC. That's for you, Mr. Travers. It was some very outstanding football players that went on and had great careers and won Super Bowl rings. 66 is a special year in college football. And I wish that if my dream before I leave here is that one day we can interview Bob Greasy before he leaves. We can interview, he's gone to glory now, Ken Snake, the Snake Stabler, and Ray Perkins. But just talk to those gentlemen, what was it like to be in that year, 66, Terry Hanratty, Gary Beeman, who was a junior that year at UCLA. 66 is a special year. It was the first year of the Super Bowl. Lamar Hunt came up with the term. Special year in sports, special year in music, man. Just special all over. And just love. And one more guy. When I think about 1966, I think about the young man from Denton, Texas, as I'm at the end of the day here on 100 yards of football. Everybody loves him, whether he was white, black, green, or yellow. I want to take you higher, higher. Do, 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 do. Slide in the family stone. That's how I'm at the end of the day here on 100 yards of football. Back to you, Harp.
Well, there you have it, folks. Some great names from the past, and hopefully they connect with you. If you've got a few gray hairs in your head, you'll certainly go in the Wayback Machine with us and enjoy some of the amazing and sometimes trying times of 1966. We called this show The Missing Ring today. Obviously, there's been multiple books that have been written about it, and the controversy in some respects is over, but the ability to have the debate and to talk about it is something that certainly brings back a lot of memories. So the Alabama football team from 1966 in cahoots with Michigan State and Notre Dame and some of the other great teams and obviously great artists, we wanted to feature them here today. So thank you for tuning in to 100 Yards of Football. For Jeremiah Long, our producer and engineer, for Vincent Turner, our host and the founder here of 100 Yards of Football, I'm Harper LeBel saying thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Have a fantastic rest of your day.